Well, thank you, Jonathan. Esteemed hosts, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here for my second time in Herzliya to present to you the United Nations 1267 and 1988 Committee's Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team's view of the evolving terrorist threat. The monitoring team was created in 2004 to support the United Nations Security Council Committee charged with implementing Resolution 1267 of 1999, imposing sanctions on the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and on individuals, groups and entities associated with them. In 2011, Resolutions 1988 and 1989 created separate committees for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, retaining one monitoring team to support both of them. Isil then emerged and was added to the Al-Qaeda committee's purview in 2015. The team comprises 10 experts from 10 different member states based in New York City. It supports the Security Council essentially in three ways. Firstly, assessing the global threat from Isil and Al-Qaeda in biannual reports and in regular oral briefings to the 1267 Committee, also by drafting the threat part of the United Nations Secretary-General's regular report on Isil, which the CTED Executive Director referred to when she addressed you yesterday. In addition, once a year, we report on the threat posed by the Taliban to peace and stability in Afghanistan. Second thing that we do is we collect information from member states on individuals and entities on both sanctions lists to keep them accurate, relevant, and detailed enough for conclusive identification. We travel extensively to member states to raise awareness and to generate new proposals for designations. And then in a third area that we help, we prepare and we present recommendations to make the three sanctions measures, the assets freeze, the travel ban, the arms embargo, more effective. These are often picked up and included in new counter-terrorist UN Security Council resolutions. We also aim to improve implementation of the sanctions regimes and member states' compliance. The team works on its global mandate with member states, with UN missions and agencies, and other relevant bodies like Interpol, Europol, IATA, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the World Customs Organization, the Financial Action Task Force and its regional bodies, and representatives of the private sector, financial institutions, but also relevant non-financial businesses and professions. To support intra-UN synergies and efficiency, the team works closely with the Office of Counter-Terrorism and with CTED, as well as with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and other UN counter-terrorism entities. We participate in the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, including the Global Compact and its most relevant working groups. We are explicitly mandated to consult in confidence with member states' intelligence and security services, and that distinguishes us from other UN entities. Thus, we offer a significant niche capability to the UN's overall CT effort. Our assessment of the threat is vital to other UN Global Compact entities' calibration and prioritization of their work. Again, as Michel Connick said yesterday, that evidence base that's required in order to make sure that the UN spends its time and resources effectively. The team organizes closed regional meetings for the counter-terrorism leaderships of intelligence and security services in a number of strategic parts of the world. And this is a contribution to the UN objective of generating and enhancing cooperation between and amongst member states' CT agencies. The team is also mandated by various resolutions to develop information on some specific issues during our consultations with member states. Foreign terrorist fighters, or FTFs, people trafficking and sexual violence in conflict, illicit trade in antiquities and cultural property, terror finance, links between terrorism and organized crime, terrorist acquisition of arms, and threats to the security of aviation. Let me turn to the threat, the global threat posed by Isil and Al-Qaeda, and with huge respect to the panel who spoke just now, it's quite difficult to follow that, and if I skate over it, then that's because so many eminent people have already covered so many of these areas in such detail. But I will draw on the monitoring team's 24th report, which we completed at the end of June and which is available online. I'll focus on a few key developments since the last Herzliya conference. First and foremost, the military defeat of Isil was completed in eastern Syria in March. The fall of Baghouz yielded a larger than expected movement of refugees and fighters. With Al-Hal camp now severely overcrowded, the urgency of the security and the humanitarian challenge has become clear, but solutions remain elusive. In parts of the country where the Syrian government has retaken control, there is unrepaired damage, alienation, and only an uneasy peace. And meanwhile, in Iraq, the authorities face acute problems of overcrowded detention facilities, an overloaded judicial system, internally displaced persons, intercommunal tensions, and a reconstruction deficit. In Turkey, just across the border, there are 3.6 million Syrian refugees. Now, ISIL's covert network in Syria is being established at the provincial level, much as we heard just now, a mirror image of what we've been seeing happening in Iraq since 2017. In its core area, it has moved into the phase of adaptation, consolidation, creating conditions for an eventual resurgence. No longer having to defend territory, ISIL has found the bandwidth to resume attacks in government of Syria-controlled areas. Northwestern Syria is a base for many extremists and has been called the world's largest dumping ground for FTFs. The latest military escalation displaced large numbers of civilians. ISIL may exploit any new refugee crisis to move their fighters into Turkey. The Al-Qaeda-aligned Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Hurras ad-Din, who are, as we just heard, focused very much on trying to create their form of governance in Syria, they are likely to stand and fight. But I understand from member states that I've spoken to that ISIL has already decided to effect a tactical withdrawal. They don't want to lose resources in that fight. The question now is whether the authorities in Damascus and Baghdad can meet the needs and aspirations of their marginalized communities. With oil wealth and the control of the ground, Iraq is better placed, but still struggling. The situation in Syria, including the issue of control in the northeast, looks harder and less promising. Eventual ISIL resurgence in the former so-called caliphate area cannot be ruled out. Many ISIL leaders have survived and are hiding in Syria, including in the Idlib area. The majority of the leadership is in Iraq, and there are some in Turkey as well. ISIL discriminates between its personnel. Foot soldiers, including many FTFs, are seen as dispensable. Leaders and key seniors are being kept safe and financed. Syrians and Iraqis are being favoured over foreigners. The priority is definitely survival and revival in the heartland. The somewhat cavalier attitude to their foreign contingent may cost them in terms of future opportunities, in contrast with regular operations in the heartland and in some of the remote provinces. Directed international attacks are still way down from 2015-2016 levels, as are facilitated and inspired attacks. This may not change imminently, but it will eventually. Once survival is assured, ISIL will reinvest in its external operations capability, and indeed, as was said in the previous panel discussion, possibly in unexpected locations. Key criteria are the time and space in a safe haven to start to project an organized threat. We've seen signs of this happening with ISIL and Al-Qaeda at various times in various places. Long term, it will probably give strategic attack options to the surviving leaderships. I want to mention Sri Lanka in this respect. It's clear that ISIL core knew nothing of the Easter Sunday attacks in advance. Baghdadi's April message reference was just an afterthought. But an ISIL-inspired presence had incubated in Sri Lanka and developed a sophisticated capability. It had foreign links, but it was locally generated, financed and led. It was a classic inspired attack. Already the shock value and the scale of the Sri Lankan attacks has had an effect on the global inspired terrorist threat and on the narrative of revenge for Christchurch, Baghouz, etc. I think we should expect to see more attacks of this kind in the coming months, although not necessarily, let us hope, on the same scale. And certainly that would be consistent with the sort of message that Baghdadi was putting across in his video. This is the post-Baghouz phase. It's the phase where ISIL very much welcomes inspired attacks. It very much wants to see new branches declaring loyalty. It wants to keep the message alive, the virtual caliphate, so-called. ISIL and far-right terrorists' clash of civilizations narratives, of course, feed off each other's atrocities, and that's a troubling trend in itself. Violent extremists' real enemies, of course, are liberal politics and the rule of law. ISIL's centre of gravity in South Asia is Afghanistan, as Dr. Hans just said when he was speaking on this. Our 1267 committee recently sanctioned IS Khorasan province, ISIL-K, as a separate entity. Despite taking casualty on many fronts against Afghan security forces, coalition troops and the Taliban, ISIL-K is resilient, launching attacks, including in Kabul, with impact disproportionate to its numbers. It has had a difficult year recently, the reference earlier to the destruction of its presence in the north in Jawzjan, but it continues to attract new recruits. The estimates of its strength vary very widely between member states, but our estimate is 2,500 to 4,000 active members in ISIL-K. And Afghanistan is an arena where ISIL might develop an external operations capability. And incidentally, since I mentioned the sanctioning of ISIL-K separately by the 1267 committee, I will also mention that it's not so long ago that we sanctioned HTS as an alias of al-Nusra Front. And I mention that particularly because of what was said earlier about the threat from HTS. That is recognized in the UN, and there was definitely a conscious decision taken to emphasize the threat that HTS potentially poses. HTS has a very large number of foreign terrorist fighters. Again, that begs the question of what those people are really in it for, if not ultimately to pose an external threat. Returning to Afghanistan, as Dr. Hans said, many al-Qaeda and Taliban-aligned extremist groups are present there, and Central Asian neighbours are concerned about this, about the potential cross-border threat from these, as well as potentially from ISIL. But this is currently constrained by the Taliban, which is trying to send the message that there is no threat emanating from Afghanistan. But I very much agree with what was said earlier about the fact that this is work in progress. It's not clear that the situation that I describe now will be the situation later, and what people's current objectives are may not be the same as their longer-term objectives. Afghan politics and the peace process are evolving, and it's not clear whether Afghan negotiations may reduce or increase the external threat. Another region of CT concern, again very ably covered by our esteemed Nigerian guests and also by the panel just now, West Africa and the Sahel, where areas of extremism are spreading and starting to merge in some places. The al-Qaeda-aligned Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, JNIM, is increasingly effective. It's proved to be quite a stable coalition. And although the relations with IS branches are murky, unlike in Yemen and Somalia, where you see absolute violence by al-Shabaab and by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to suppress and potentially destroy the local manifestations of IS and return violence, of course, from IS. What we see in the Sahel is deconfliction and avoidance of conflict, and even cooperation sometimes. Some joint operations, which we have heard reported between JNIM and the Islamic State Greater Sahara in Mali and Niger. And then deconfliction also of JNIM with Ansar al-Islam in Burkina Faso. There's a clear aim to destabilize Burkina Faso, and we should be concerned about this because there are some signs of success in this. Meanwhile, ISIL, and again this is linked with the sort of the plans that they made for the post-Baghouz phase, devolving authority, moving to something more of a hub-and-spoke model, allowing most prominent affiliates to lead or assist lesser ones in the same region. IS West Africa province has certainly grown in power and ambition, It now claims attacks on behalf of ISGS. And a contiguous area of instability is emerging in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, threatening the stability then of the Atlantic littoral states, Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Côte d'Ivoire. Now, all of this is without going into any detail on other parts of Africa that were so well covered just now, or on Yemen, or indeed on Mindanao in the southern Philippines, which is the extremist hub in southeastern Asia. Briefly turning, though, to Western Europe, where the authorities, I think, are at cross purposes about how to deal with domestic extremists, FTFs, and frustrated travellers. The issues of radicalisation in prisons and release of extremist prisoners, which came up in the Croatian presentation earlier, these are also growing challenges in Western Europe. And of course, these same challenges exist in a number of other countries. You see them in North America too. Maybe some of the more prosperous states have the resources to deal with these challenges, but they are struggling. So when you transpose those challenges to other countries that have less resources, fewer resources, then it's very troubling as to how successfully these will be addressed. ISIL's military defeat is certainly good news, and we must acknowledge it as good news, but the whole nexus of post-caliphate issues, what to do with the people who fought for it, worked for it, lived under it, is massive in the short term and beyond. And I suppose that's the answer I would have given to the question that was asked to the panel about the threat. You know, a huge part of the current threat, the threat that we're facing immediately, is getting this right with the handling of the detritus from the caliphate. You know, what do you do with these people? The numbers are huge. More than 40,000 travelled to join this particular jihad. And a rough calculation of the attrition rate suggests that well over 20,000 of these, sometimes you see, you know, an estimate that could even push up towards 30,000, may still be alive. So we have detainees, we have fugitives, we have returnees, we have relocators, we have women who may be as dangerous as the men. We have kids, many of them undocumented, some of the older ones hardened and brutalized. We face short, medium, and long-term risks if we mishandle this in any way. It's a generational challenge, which is illustrated rather well, I think, by the fact that an Indonesian FTF who was killed last year in Syria was 5 years old when his father took part in the 2002 Bali bombing. And I really want to sort of close with the emphasis on that point, because I think one of the speakers yesterday talked about the challenge over 10 years, 20 years, and that was not an exaggeration. If anything, that's an understatement. We must remember that in many cases, how this is handled now by the international community, and it requires the international community, and it certainly requires the convening power and the organizing power of the United Nations. If we get this wrong now, then the ramifications will be felt, I think, 10, 20, but 30 and more years into the future. I hope I don't sound too pessimistic in all of this. As Leonard Cohen said, I think of a pessimist as someone who is always expecting rain, whereas I see myself as already soaked to the skin. So, but seriously, the underlying conditions exist for Takfiri terrorism, jihadi terrorism, to be with us for the foreseeable future, whether in the form of Isil, Al-Qaeda 2.0, mutations like jihadi nationalism, coalitions like JNIM, or some brand new brand. I'll finish there. I'm more than happy over lunch later to talk about these things in more detail with anyone who'd like to. Thank you for your attention.